Before history became dates, it was memory. And in one of humanity's oldest written traditions, that memory reaches into an impossible distance. Kings who are said to have ruled not for lifetimes, but for tens of thousands of years. If the numbers are only myth, why were they written beside real cities? If they are not simple history, what kind of loss are they pointing toward? The Sumerian King List records kings who ruled for 28,000 years, and we can't explain it. So what was humanity trying to remember? Long before history became a line of dates, it was a fragile act of memory. A city remembered a king. A temple remembered an offering. A scribe pressed a reed into wet clay and tried to hold one small piece of time still. That is why the Sumerian King List feels so strange when we first meet it. It looks, in many ways, like a record. It names cities. It speaks of kingship passing from one place to another. It belongs to early Mesopotamia, where writing was not decoration but a tool for grain, labour, land, power and order. Yet inside that orderly frame, the years suddenly become impossible. A ruler is not said to reign for 20 years or 40, or even a long human lifetime. Some are given reigns that stretch across tens of thousands of years, far beyond the body, far beyond memory, far beyond anything a human being could live through in the ordinary biological sense. The first cold fact is not that ancient people were foolish. It is almost the opposite. They were careful enough to invent ways of recording names, cities, quantities, and succession. They knew that power had to be remembered if it was to be recognized. They knew that a city could rise, decline, and lose its place to another. The difficulty is that this careful memory also preserved numbers that do not fit the scale of human life. That is the quiet paradox on the clay. The same tradition that anchors kingship in recognizable cities also opens a door into a time that no single human body could have crossed. To understand why this matters, we begin not with the claim that these reigns were literally true, but with the older human need that made such a list worth preserving. Human beings began as creatures of memory long before they became creatures of writing. For most of our existence, the past lived in voices, gestures, burial places, paths through a landscape and stories repeated beside firelight. A group could remember where water had been found, where danger had appeared, where ancestors had gone, and which names deserved to be carried forward. When settled life grew more complex, memory had to change shape. Grain stores, workers, fields and rulers created a heavier burden than speech could carry. Clay became a second mind outside the body. It did not breathe, age or forget as a person did. Once memory moved onto clay, something new happened. Communities could preserve practical accounts, but also older claims about origin, authority and time. The Sumerian King List stands near that meeting place. It is not a modern history book, and it should not be treated as one. It is also not a meaningless fantasy. Its force comes from the way it joins things that feel different to us. Names from the political world, cities from real landscapes, and reign lengths from a scale outside ordinary experience. A modern listener may want to separate these layers quickly, placing history on one side and myth on the other. But the people who copied and preserved such traditions may not have drawn that boundary in the same way. For them, the beginning of rule could be imagined as something older and higher than any living ruler, something received, transferred, lost, and restored. The large numbers do not have to be accepted as literal lifespans in order to matter. They matter because they show that early civilization was not only measuring time, it was giving time a shape. It was trying to say that kingship had a depth greater than one generation, greater than one city, perhaps greater than ordinary human memory itself. The Sumerian King List records kings who ruled for 28,000 years, and we cannot explain it in a simple way, because the puzzle is not only about numbers, it is about why one of humanity's earliest written traditions placed impossible time beside real political memory. The Sumerian King List is difficult, because it asks us to hold two truths at the same time. It is a real ancient tradition known from clay tablets and later copies, created in a world where writing had already become a serious instrument of administration, temple life and royal memory. At the same time, it contains material that belongs to a sacred and legendary imagination, especially when it speaks of kingship before the flood, and of reigns that no human body could survive. A careful reading has to move slowly between those truths. If we call it only myth, we lose the cities, the political sequence, and the historical atmosphere that shaped it. If we call it only history, we force its numbers into a modern frame they were never meant to obey. The safer path is to treat it as a record of how early Mesopotamian culture thought about rule, origin, and time. It does not simply list people. It tells a civilization where authority came from, where it moved, and how long its shadow was supposed to reach. The text names places such as Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurapak, Kish, Uruk, Ur, and others known from the landscape and memory of southern Mesopotamia. Some of these places are tied to archaeological remains, written traditions, or later historical horizons. Yet the earliest reigns are placed on a scale that moves beyond ordinary life. This mixture is not a mistake to be dismissed too quickly. It is exactly what makes the list valuable. It shows us a mind shaped by canals, temples, city walls, scribal schools, and the long pressure of remembering power across generations. The beginning of human history did not arrive as a clean border between fact and story. It grew from older habits of memory. Before writing, a community remembered through repetition, ancestry, ritual, and place. When writing appeared, those older forms did not vanish. They entered the clay with the accounts of grain and workers. A tablet could preserve a number of sheep, but it could also preserve a claim that rule itself had descended from a realm beyond ordinary life. This is why the King List feels both administrative and dreamlike. It carries the sound of a society learning to make memory durable, while still using memory in ways older than writing itself. The long reigns, including the famous claim of kings who ruled for 28,000 years, should not be presented as proven human lifespans. That would be dishonest, and it would misunderstand both biology and evidence. Human bodies age, generations pass. Bones, settlements, and tools tell us that ancient people lived within limits, even when their cultures imagined time in larger forms. The question then is not whether one individual literally sat on a throne for thousands of years in the way a modern ruler might serve for decades. The deeper question is why a learned scribal tradition kept such numbers at all. They may have helped magnify the sacred distance of the past. They may have marked a world before ordinary historical time. They may have made kingship appear older than any city that currently held it. They may have organized political memory into a pattern where authority moves from city to city like a precious force that can be granted, lost, and received again. None of these explanations solves the problem completely. Each only shows a possible function that large numbers could serve. The evidence remains uneven, so the responsible voice must stay careful, patient, and close to what the clay can truly support. What matters for our path is the balance. The Sumerian King List is not evidence that humans once lived for tens of thousands of years. It is evidence that one early civilization imagined the beginning of rule on a scale far larger than a human life, and then chose to preserve that imagination in writing for future rulers. The deepest question raised by the Sumerian King List is not simply why the reigns are so long. It is why those reigns were placed beside cities that belong to the remembered geography of Mesopotamia. A purely imagined tale could have floated in a land without names, beyond fields and rivers. A practical political record could have stayed close to ordinary reigns, ordinary succession, and ordinary human scale. Instead, the list joins the two. It speaks of places that people could locate in a shared world, and then gives some rulers durations that seem to break away from that world. That joining is the source of the unease. The clay does not allow us to rest in one easy answer. It asks us to notice that early written memory could hold fact, ceremony, politics, and sacred imagination in the same frame. For the people of southern Mesopotamia, a city was not only a cluster of houses, it was a centre of fields, canals, gods, labour, storage, judgment, and identity. To say that kingship belonged to one city, then moved to another, was to describe more than a change of ruler. It was to describe the movement of order itself. The world could be flooded, broken, or reassembled, but kingship remained something that could return. This matters because the beginning of civilization was not only the beginning of larger buildings or better tools. It was also the beginning of heavier memory. Small groups can carry much of their past in living bodies. Elders remember names. Hunters remember paths. Families remember graves. But cities require memory that survives beyond one generation. They need records, lists, measures, and stories strong enough to hold many lives together. The King List belongs to that human shift, from memory held inside the body to memory stored outside it. Once that happened, people could preserve not only what they counted, but also what they believed gave counting meaning. The impossible reigns may be one element in that attempt to stretch authority backward, beyond the reach of living memory. They may mark a time that was not meant to be ordinary time, a distant beginning where political power was imagined as older than the cities that later claimed it. They may also show how early rulers used the past to make the present feel less accidental. A king who ruled now was not merely a strong man in one city. He could be placed in a chain reaching back through floods, vanished cities, and names too old to hold. Yet we must be careful. We cannot turn caution into certainty. The list does not prove that there was a lost race of humans with lifespans measured in millennia. It does not prove that the numbers hide a code waiting to be solved. It does not give us permission to invent a vanished world and call it history. The responsible reading stays close to what can be said. The text shows that ancient scribes preserved a tradition in which political memory was given a sacred depth. It shows that early Mesopotamians imagined the origin of rule as something larger than a normal human career. It shows that real cities could be woven into a story of time so vast that the human body disappears inside it. At the origin of written civilization, humanity was facing a problem. A single life is brief, but communities need a past long enough to explain why they exist. A body can remember only so much, but a society wants to remember more than any body can carry. The Sumerian King List may be strange because it stands at that threshold. It is not just a list of rulers. It is a record of the moment when human beings began placing their lives inside a larger time, and the unanswered question is why the first written memories of kingship needed time to become inhuman. To understand why a list of impossible reigns could be written down at all, the ground beneath it has to become visible. Southern Mesopotamia was not a quiet stage waiting for kings. It was a low, demanding landscape shaped by the Tigris and Euphrates, by seasonal water, silt, reeds, marsh edges, heat, and open alluvial plain. The land could give grain, but it did not give it without organization. Water had to be guided, fields had to be measured, canals had to be cleared, labor had to be gathered before the season passed. Mud was everywhere, not as dirt to be ignored, but as the material of walls, tablets, ceilings, ovens, floors, and memory. In such a place, civilization did not rise above nature as if nature had been defeated. It rose by learning to live inside a narrow agreement with water and soil. Too little water could weaken the field. Too much could break the banks, erase boundaries, and return ordered land to uncertainty. This is important for the Sumerian King List, because kingship in that world was not an abstract idea floating above the earth. Authority was tied to the ability to hold a city together in a landscape that constantly required coordination. A ruler, a temple household, a group of officials, and a community of workers were all bound to the same practical question. How can a human settlement survive long enough for memory to matter? The earliest deep origin of this question lies far before Sumer, in the long human movement from mobile bands to more settled communities. Human beings had always depended on place, but settled farming made dependence heavier. A camp could move when conditions changed. A city could not move so easily. Once people stored grain, built walls, and tied families to fields, time became more demanding. The next flood, the next harvest, the next transfer of authority, the next generation of workers and children all had to be held in mind. Southern Mesopotamia made that burden especially clear. Its cities were born from mud and water, but they needed rules, calendars, measurements, and shared belief to remain cities at all. Temples rose as economic and sacred centers, not only places of prayer in a modern sense, but places where offerings, labor, land, and divine order could meet. Around them, households, craft workers, traders, farmers, and scribes helped form a world where no single person could remember everything. The clay tablet became possible because the landscape demanded memory outside the body. It is easy to imagine writing as a sudden intellectual invention, But in this setting, it also looks like a practical response to pressure. Grain entered storage. Sheep were counted. Workers received rations. Land changed hands. Promises had to outlive the spoken moment. When a reed stylus pressed signs into wet clay, it was answering the same basic human problem that began with our oldest ancestors: how to carry useful knowledge beyond one fragile life. What changed in Mesopotamia was the scale. Memory no longer served only a family, a hunting path, or a seasonal gathering place. It served cities. It served institutions. It served rulers who wanted their authority to be seen as more than temporary force. This is the world that makes the King List understandable, even before its strange numbers are addressed. A society that fought constantly against forgetting practical obligations could also become a society that preserved grand claims about the past. The same mud that recorded a delivery of barley could hold a statement about kingship descending, moving, vanishing, and returning. The same cities that needed canal workers and stored grain could imagine themselves as points in a sacred sequence of rule. In that sense, the impossible reigns did not appear in empty space. They emerged from a world where time, labour, water, authority, and inherited memory had already become tightly woven into daily survival across generations. Writing in southern Mesopotamia did not begin as a quiet wish to tell stories about kings. It grew from the weight of ordinary things that had become too numerous, too scattered, and too important to trust only to memory. Grain had to be collected, stored, measured, and distributed. Workers had to be assigned to fields, canals, temples, building sites, and workshops. Animals had to be counted. Offerings had to be recorded. Land, rations, debts, and deliveries had to remain clear after the speaker had walked away. In a small group, the human mind can hold many relationships directly. A person may know who helped, who owed, who returned, and who failed to appear. But a city changes the scale of trust. Faces multiply, duties separate. Food moves from fields into storage rooms, from storage rooms into rations, from rations into bodies that work again the next day. The chain becomes longer than one memory can safely hold. Clay tablets answered that pressure. They gave society a way to slow down forgetting. A mark pressed into wet clay could outlast breath. A sealed lump of mud could protect a container, a promise, or a transfer. A written sign could allow an institution to remember without depending on the mood, age, or honesty of one living witness. This was not a small change in the human story. It was one of the moments when memory began to leave the body and become a shared tool outside it. The origin of humanity is filled with such shifts. Our ancestors survived by remembering landscapes, seasons, animals, plants, kinship, danger, and cooperation. That memory was carried in brains shaped by social life and long learning. Mesopotamian writing did not replace that older memory, it extended it. The same human need that once remembered a path to water now remembered a canal schedule, a ration list, or the authority of a temple household. The body remained limited, but the system around the body grew larger. This helps explain why a society that wrote practical accounts could also write something like the Sumerian King List. Once writing became a trusted keeper of order, it could preserve more than barley and sheep. It could preserve the political imagination of a culture. Power needed memory as much as food did. A ruler whose name could be written gained a different kind of presence. A city whose place in a sequence could be written was no longer only a settlement in the mud. It became a station in remembered time. Kingship, in such a world, could be described as something that moved, settled, vanished, and returned. The list of rulers was therefore not detached from daily administration. It grew from the same world of counting, storing, assigning, and legitimizing. Authority depended on the belief that the present order had roots deeper than the present moment. A grain account says that food passed through hands. A royal list says that power passed through cities. Both depend on the idea that the past can be fixed long enough to guide action in the future. The strange reign lengths become more understandable when placed beside this need for durable order. They do not become literal biological evidence, and they should not be treated that way. They become signs of a culture using the tools of record to stretch political memory beyond living generations. For early city dwellers, time was no longer only sunrise, hunger, work, sleep, and season. Time became institutional. It belonged to storehouses, temples, dynasties, ancestors, and gods. Human beings had always lived inside time, but now they were building structures that could speak across time. That is why the King List belongs so closely to the beginning of written civilization. It is not simply a curiosity about ancient numbers. It is a reminder that the first written worlds were built to manage survival, and then quickly began to ask where authority itself had begun. The movement from spoken memory to clay memory did not erase the older human mind. It carried that mind into a new material. For most of our species' existence, memory lived in bodies. It lived in a grandmother's voice, in the careful watching of weather, in the remembered shape of a riverbank, in the warning attached to a dangerous place, in the repeated names of the dead. A story was not only entertainment, it was a tool for survival. It told people where they belonged, what had happened before, which actions had consequences, and how a group could remain connected across time. In that older world, memory was warm, living, and vulnerable. It depended on breath. It depended on attention. It could change with each telling, not always because someone meant to deceive, but because human memory is shaped by need, fear, loss, and repetition. When people began to live in larger settled communities, this ancient memory did not become useless. It became insufficient by itself. A city needed more than remembered voices. It needed marks that could wait silently after the speaker was gone. Clay became one answer to that need. Wet mud from the same landscape that made walls and vessels could also receive signs. Once dried, it could hold a thought more steadily than a living mouth could hold it. This was a quiet revolution in the human story. The past could now sit outside the skull. The origin of human culture had always depended on sharing what one life could not discover alone. A child did not have to test every plant, every animal, every path, every danger. Knowledge passed forward, and that passing made human beings different from creatures that relied mostly on instinct. Writing extended that passage beyond the limits of face-to-face life. It allowed a community to remember in the absence of the person who first knew. In southern Mesopotamia, this mattered because social life had become dense. Work was divided. Food was stored. Temples gathered offerings. Rulers claimed authority. Cities competed, traded, fought, and rebuilt. Under those conditions, memory became a public structure. It was no longer only the private inheritance of families. It became something institutions could keep, copy, and use. The Sumerian King List belongs to that new structure, but it also carries the echo of older oral memory. Its form suggests order, sequence, and record, yet its earliest horizons reach into a time where ordinary history fades. That mixture should be expected, not dismissed. Writing often begins by capturing what people already say, believe, recite, and inherit. The clay tablet does not create memory from nothing. It catches a stream that was already moving. When a scribe wrote a tradition of kingship, he was not only making a list, he was fixing a way of imagining the beginning of political order. This is why the long reigns matter. They may preserve less a literal biography than a remembered distance, a sense that the first age of rule stood far beyond normal experience. The numbers create an atmosphere of depth. They push kingship backward until it appears almost older than humanity as a settled, urban creature. Yet the force of the list depends on the same basic human need that began in much smaller groups, the need to place the present inside a remembered beginning. Early humans did this with stories of ancestors, landscapes, and first events. City societies did it with temples, rulers, tablets, and sequences of power. The material changed, but the need remained recognizable. To ask why the Sumerian King List records kings who ruled for 28,000 years is therefore also to ask why human beings make memory larger than life. Clay did not simply preserve facts. It preserved the shape of longing, authority, fear of forgetting, and the wish to make a fragile present feel connected to a beginning older than any living voice could carry. The Sumerian King List is often spoken of as if it were one single object, but that is already a little misleading. What survives is a scribal tradition known through several ancient witnesses, copied in different forms in different places, and probably for different purposes. Some copies are fragmentary. Some preserve more names than others. Some arrange the material with slight differences. This matters because a modern listener may imagine a finished book, written once by one author, as if an ancient historian sat down to produce a final account of Mesopotamia. That is not the world we are entering. We are looking at a tradition shaped by copying, teaching, royal interest, memory, and selection. It moved through scribal hands. It was not frozen in one perfect form. The clay that preserved it was durable, but the tradition behind it was alive. A scribe could copy an older version, adjust wording, preserve a known sequence, or work within expectations passed down by teachers. This does not make the list useless. It makes it human. It tells us that early written history was not born as a clean scientific discipline. It grew from institutions that needed to remember authority. The list is therefore best approached as a political and cultural document, not as a simple timetable of biological lives. Its famous long reigns sit inside a larger design. That design begins with the idea that kingship existed, descended, and then belonged to a city. After a time, kingship moved elsewhere. The pattern repeats. Rule is not treated as merely personal. It is almost like a force that can rest in one place and then pass to another. This idea fits a world of city-states, temples, rivalry, conquest, and inherited prestige. Southern Mesopotamian cities did not live alone in empty space. They shared rivers, trade routes, sacred traditions, conflicts, and memories of dominance. To place them in a single sequence was to arrange a complicated world into an ordered past. The beginning of human civilization often involved exactly this kind of ordering. People did not only build walls and canals, they also built stories that told them why one place mattered, why one ruler should be obeyed, and why the present order had older roots. In the Sumerian King List, the record of rule becomes a way of placing cities inside time. Some rulers from later horizons may connect with figures known from other traditions or inscriptions, though not every name can be handled with the same confidence. The early material is especially distant. It belongs to a zone where evidence is thinner and where sacred imagination is clearly present. That is why caution is necessary. We cannot read every line as a modern fact. We also cannot throw the whole tradition away because some numbers are impossible. The list gives us evidence of what people chose to remember, what they wanted to connect, and how they imagined political origin. It is like looking at a river carrying different kinds of sediment. Some grains come from real cities, some from royal ideology, some from mythic time, some from the practical needs of scribal culture. All of them settle together on the tablet. The question of the 28,000-year reigns belongs inside that mixed current. Those numbers are not isolated decorations. They appear in a tradition that wants kingship to have depth, continuity, and sacred weight. The document asks us to think about how early humans, once gathered into cities, used writing to stretch memory far beyond lived experience. At the origin of written civilization, memory did not simply become more accurate, it became more powerful. It could join a place that people knew with a time no body could measure. That is what makes the Sumerian King List so difficult and so valuable. It is not one clear window into what happened. It is a preserved trace of how an early civilization made the past serve authority, identity, and the need to belong to a beginning. At the center of the Sumerian King List is a simple movement that carries a very large idea. Kingship passes from one city to another. The text does not present rule as something every community owns equally at the same time. It speaks as if legitimate kingship rests in one place, then after defeat, decline, flood, or change, it is taken elsewhere. This pattern gives the list its rhythm. A city receives kingship. A sequence of rulers follows. Then the city's turn ends, and kingship moves on. To a modern reader, this may sound like a political timeline, but in the world of early Mesopotamia, it was more than that. The cities of the southern plain were close enough to share a cultural world, yet separate enough to compete for land, labour, trade, prestige, and sacred authority. A list that arranged them into one line did not merely remember rulers. It organised rivalry into meaning. It suggested that power was not random. It had a path. That path could be traced backward into the oldest remembered time, and forward toward the rulers who wished to stand inside it. This is why the structure matters for the question of impossible reigns. The strange numbers are not floating alone. They belong to a design in which authority has direction, weight, and transfer. When kingship is said to move, the text turns political change into a kind of cosmic sequence. One city does not simply become stronger than another. It becomes the place where order has settled for a while. When that order leaves, the city does not merely lose a battle or a dynasty, it loses its place in the chain of remembered authority. Human beings have always tried to make change bearable by giving it a pattern. At the older origin of human social life, a group could explain movement through remembered paths, seasonal return, kinship, or ancestral places. In the city world, movement became more institutional. Grain moved through storehouses, workers moved through assignments, offerings moved toward temples, and kingship, in the language of the list, moved through cities. The text turns the political landscape into a remembered sequence, as if history itself were a road taken by power. This helps explain why real places and extraordinary durations can stand together. The cities give the list an earthly map. The reign lengths give it a depth that exceeds normal memory. A city like Kish or Uruk could be understood as a location within the world people knew, but the earliest reigns pull that world backward into a distance where ordinary human measure begins to fail. The result is not a modern historical record, but a structured memory of legitimacy. It tells later listeners that power had beginnings before them, that cities had turns before them, and that no present ruler stood alone. Such a message would have mattered in a society where authority needed more than force. It needed recognition. It needed a story that could outlive one reign and explain why obedience made sense. The King List offered one such story by making kingship older than the individual king. Even a powerful ruler was temporary, but kingship itself appeared ancient, transferable, and larger than any body. That may be one reason the long reigns carry such force. A reign of many thousands of years does not fit human biology, but it does make the earliest stage of rule feel almost unreachable. It surrounds the origin of kingship with distance. It separates the first rulers from the ordinary scale of later kings. Yet the list gradually moves closer to names and cities that feel more historical, creating a slow descent from deep remembered time into a world that can be compared more carefully with other evidence. The structure therefore works like a bridge, though not a bridge made of certainty. It crosses from sacred beginning to political memory, from imagined antiquity to cities of mud brick, fields, canals, and scribes. It does not solve the 28,000-year puzzle, but it shows where the puzzle lives, inside a tradition that made power travel through time, because human communities needed the present to feel attached to a beginning older than themselves. The most important mistake would be to force the Sumerian King List into only one category. If it is treated as a literal record in the modern sense, the long reigns become impossible almost immediately. A human body cannot rule for thousands of years, and nothing in accepted evidence from biology or archaeology supports the idea that ancient people once lived on that scale. Bones, burial evidence, settlement remains, and the general pattern of human life all point toward bodies limited by growth, illness, injury, aging, hunger, and death. Yet the opposite mistake is also too easy. If the list is dismissed as nonsense because some of its numbers cannot be literal, then we lose the reason it was copied, taught, and preserved. Ancient scribes did not have to save meaningless words. A tradition that survived in clay did so because it carried value for the people who handled it. Its value may not be the value of a modern timeline, but that does not make it empty. It can tell us how early Mesopotamians arranged political memory, how they imagined the origin of rule, and how they connected real cities to a past that felt deeper than experience. This distinction is central to the question of kings who ruled for 28,000 years. The number may not describe a biological lifetime, but it still describes something in the mind of the culture that preserved it. It may describe distance. It may describe sacred authority. It may describe a first age placed beyond normal measurement. It may show how a society made the beginning of kingship appear older than any living generation could challenge. Human beings have always done more than remember events. From the earliest social groups onward, people also remembered meaning. They remembered who belonged, where the group began, why certain places mattered, and why certain names should not disappear. As communities grew into cities, that need did not vanish. It became heavier. A city had to remember not only ancestors and paths, but offices, temples, fields, dynasties, victories, losses, and transfers of power. The Sumerian King List belongs to that heavier memory. It should be read as a cultural artifact that carries historical traces, political claims, and mythic language at the same time. These layers do not cancel one another. They explain why the text is so difficult. A city named in the list may belong to the known world of southern Mesopotamia, while a reign length attached to an early ruler may belong to symbolic or legendary time. A later ruler may stand closer to evidence that can be compared with inscriptions or archaeology, while an earlier ruler may stand inside a much older horizon of tradition. The careful reader allows the list to remain mixed, because early written memory itself was mixed. Writing began in practical settings, but it was quickly drawn into questions of authority, origin, and divine order. A tablet could count grain, but it could also claim that kingship had once descended from a realm beyond ordinary life. A list could organize cities, but it could also make their history feel connected to a sacred beginning. This is why the King List cannot be used as simple proof of impossible human lifespans, and also cannot be ignored as if it had no connection to real life. It sits between evidence and imagination, between the city and the cosmos, between clay record and inherited story. At the origin of written civilization, humanity was learning that memory could be stored outside the body. But once memory left the body, it did not become purely factual. It carried human fears, loyalties, political needs, and hopes into a harder material. The mystery of the long reigns begins there, in the uneasy fact that one of our earliest written traditions quietly preserved not only what people may have known, but also what they needed the past to mean. When the Sumerian King List says that kingship descended from heaven, it is not speaking about government in the narrow modern sense. It is not describing an election, a contract, or a human office created only by agreement among people. It is placing rule inside a sacred order. Kingship appears as something given, not merely taken. A ruler may sit in a city, command labor, receive tribute, lead armies, and stand before temples, but the authority behind him is imagined as older and higher than the man himself. This idea is one of the keys to the long reigns. If kingship is only a practical job, then a reign of thousands of years becomes absurd very quickly. But if kingship is a sacred force moving through the world, then the numbers may be doing something different. They may be increasing the distance between ordinary human life and the first age of rule. They may be telling the listener that the beginning of authority did not belong to everyday time. In early Mesopotamia, the city was not separated from the divine in the way many modern minds separate religion from administration. Temples were economic centers, symbolic centers, and places where the relationship between human order and divine order could be expressed. Food, labor, offerings, festivals, storage, writing, and status all touched the sacred world. A king's power, therefore, was never only about physical strength. It depended on recognition. It depended on ritual. It depended on the belief that the city's order was part of a larger order. This does not mean we must accept the old claim literally. It means we should understand the claim as a language of legitimacy. To say that kingship came from heaven was to say that rule had a source beyond the present ruler's body. The king would age and die, but kingship could continue. A dynasty could fall, but kingship could be received somewhere else. A city could lose its place, but the idea of rule remained. This is close to a much older human pattern. Long before cities, human groups needed ways to make authority understandable. Leadership in small communities may have depended on age, skill, memory, courage, generosity, ritual knowledge, or the ability to settle conflict. But even then, authority could not rest only on force for very long. People had to believe that someone's voice mattered. They had to accept guidance, remember obligations, and trust that the group's order served survival. When humans gathered into cities, the same need grew larger and more formal. A leader was no longer only a respected person among familiar faces. He stood above thousands of people, many of whom could not know him personally. Sacred kingship helped bridge that distance. It made obedience feel connected to a cosmic structure rather than to fear alone. The Sumerian King List uses this kind of imagination when it treats kingship as something that descends, settles, and moves. The office is larger than any one human life, which helps explain why the earliest reigns could be placed on a scale larger than life. The long numbers may be a way of protecting the first age from ordinary comparison. Later kings could be remembered in more human terms, but the first kings stood near the edge of sacred time. Their exaggerated durations made them feel remote, almost untouchable, not because the evidence shows that human bodies once lived that long, but because the tradition wanted the origin of rule to feel immeasurably old. This is why the titles puzzle cannot be solved by biology alone. The human body gives us one boundary. No accepted evidence allows a person to reign for 28,000 years as a single living organism. But culture gives us another question. Why would people who understood counting, labour, fields, temples, and succession preserve numbers that broke the scale of life? One answer may be that they were not only counting years, they were giving kingship a sacred depth, making the first rulers belong to a time before ordinary political memory could begin. For people who lived in the first cities of southern Mesopotamia, ordinary life was already filled with forces larger than one person. The river rose and withdrew. The canal held or failed. The harvest depended on labour performed at the right time, in the right place, by many hands acting together. A family could not manage that whole system alone. A single memory could not hold all its obligations. Out of that pressure grew institutions, and around those institutions grew ways of explaining why some commands carried special weight. It is not difficult to see why the source of power might be placed outside everyday life. If a ruler's authority came only from his body, then it would be as fragile as any body. It could be wounded, exhausted, challenged, or forgotten. But if authority came from a sacred order, then the ruler became the temporary bearer of something greater than himself. The man could die, while kingship remained. This distinction matters deeply for the Sumerian King List. The text does not need to prove that a king lived for many thousands of years in order to make kingship feel ancient. It only needs to place the first rulers near a beginning so remote that ordinary comparison becomes difficult. In early city society, power had to reach across distance. Many people who obeyed a ruler would never know him as a familiar face. They met his authority through officials, ration systems, temple obligations, work orders, soldiers' seals, and written marks. That distance required a story. Fear could compel for a time, but fear alone is unstable. Habit could guide daily obedience, but habit needs a reason to endure. Sacred origin gave rule a deeper language. It suggested that the city's order was not merely invented yesterday by ambitious men. It belonged to a pattern older than the present crowd, older than the present harvest, older than the present wall of mud brick. This does not make the claim historically literal, it makes it socially powerful. Human beings, from their earliest known communities, have used shared meaning to hold groups together. A camp, a village, or a city is never held only by food and shelter. It is also held by stories about belonging, obligation, danger, ancestry, and rightful action. In Mesopotamia, where settlement, agriculture, and urban life placed unusual weight on coordination, those stories became attached to temples, gods, cities, and kings. To say that kingship descended from heaven was to lift political rule into a cosmic frame. The long reigns then begin to look less like ordinary biographical claims and more like signs of distance from normal history. They make the first age feel vast, not because evidence shows that the human lifespan was once vast, but because the origin of authority was imagined as vast. The numbers widen the gap between the world of beginnings and the world of later rulers. They tell the listener that before familiar dynasties, before conflicts among known cities, before memories that could be tested more closely, there was an earlier horizon where kingship had a different scale. This helps us stay honest with the evidence. We do not have to turn the king list into modern fact, and we do not have to reduce it to empty invention. It can be read as an ancient attempt to solve a human problem. How can a short-lived society explain an authority that must appear older than any one life? The answer, preserved on clay, was not a scientific explanation. It was a meaningful one. Power began above ordinary life, moved into cities, and passed through rulers whose names became markers along a road of memory. At the root of that road is the same old human need to make fragile communities feel connected to a beginning deeper than living speech. The 28,000-year reigns remain unexplained in a strict historical sense, but they become more understandable as signs of how early civilizations stretched the origin of rule beyond the limits of the body. The long reigns in the Sumerian King List become less useful when they are treated only as failed arithmetic. They become more revealing when they are placed inside a world where time, power, and sacred order were woven together. A modern reader may ask how a king could rule for 28,000 years, because modern thought begins with the body, birth, growth, age, death, and the measurable span between them. That is a necessary boundary. No careful account should cross it and pretend that human biology allows such a reign. But the ancient text may not have been using years only to describe the pulse of one living body. It may have been using immense duration to describe the weight of kingship itself. A reign of impossible length makes authority feel older than ordinary memory. It creates a first horizon so distant that later rulers seem to inherit not merely an office, but a force already moving before their own cities became familiar. In that sense, the numbers may reflect a view of power more than a measurement of time. The early city world needed this kind of depth because political life was fragile. Cities rose from mud, grain, water, labor, and belief. They could be damaged by conflict, environmental strain, poor harvests, shifting channels, or the collapse of trust. A ruler could die, a dynasty could end, a city could lose its place. Yet the idea of kingship could be described as continuing, moving from one city to another, as if rule itself survived the broken bodies that carried it. This is close to a much older human problem. Since the beginning of our social life, people have needed patterns that outlast individuals. A child enters a world already filled with names, rules, paths, tools, fears, and obligations. No person invents the whole world alone. Each life receives a structure built by earlier lives. In a small community, that structure may be carried by elders and repeated memory. In a city, it needs stronger supports: temples, seals, tablets, lists, rituals, and royal names. The King List belongs to those supports. It does not simply say who ruled, it shapes how rule should be imagined. The long durations before the flood may have separated sacred beginning from ordinary political time. They may have marked an age that was not meant to be judged by the same scale as later reigns. After the flood, the numbers generally move closer to the range of historical memory, though still not always in ways that modern historians can accept without caution. That movement is important. It suggests that the list is not random. It has a structure of distance. The earliest world is vast and strange. The later world slowly becomes more familiar. The human mind often works this way when it reaches toward origins. The beginning is made larger, darker, older, and harder to measure, because beginnings carry more than information. They carry legitimacy. They explain why the present has a past beneath it. For Mesopotamian rulers, to stand within a line that began in sacred time was to stand inside a memory stronger than personal achievement. This does not solve the puzzle, and it should not be used to create a false certainty. We cannot know every intention behind every copy of the tradition. We cannot reduce all the numbers to one simple code. We cannot say that all scribes understood them in exactly the same way. What we can say is narrower and more responsible. The enormous reigns show that early written civilization used number not only to count, but also to magnify. They reveal a society in which authority needed to appear rooted beyond the ordinary life of any one ruler. The 28,000-year reigns remain impossible as human lifespans, but meaningful as signs of a world where kingship was imagined as older than the human body that briefly wore it. Before the flood, in the Sumerian King List, time changes character. The names still appear in sequence, and kingship still belongs to cities, but the reigns no longer feel attached to the length of a human life. They stretch into thousands and tens of thousands of years, creating a distance so large that the body almost disappears from the picture. This is where the list becomes most famous, and also where it becomes most dangerous to read carelessly. A listener may feel the pull of the impossible number. A king who ruled for 28,000 years seems to invite a dramatic conclusion, yet the honest path is quieter. Quote, "There is no accepted evidence that human beings once lived or ruled across such spans as biological individuals. The human body leaves many kinds of traces in the past: bones, teeth, injuries, burials, tools, settlements, food remains, and signs of labour. Those traces do not support a forgotten age of humans whose lifespans reach thousands of years. Ancient people were not outside aging. They were not outside hunger, disease, childbirth, injury, grief, or death. Their bodies belong to the same broad human condition that began long before cities and continued into the first written civilizations. That cold biological boundary is important because it protects the story from becoming false. The Sumerian King List is not valuable because it proves impossible lifespans. It is valuable because it shows how an early civilization placed the beginning of kingship in a time beyond ordinary measurement. The rulers before the flood stand near a threshold. They are close enough to be named, but too distant to be handled like later political figures. Their cities are part of the remembered sacred landscape, yet their reigns move into a scale that no living witness, no elder's voice, and no chain of family memory could preserve directly. This may be why the pre-flood world in the list feels less like a normal past and more like an origin zone. It is not simply earlier, it is different. The flood then becomes a boundary between two kinds of time: the vast, almost unreachable time before, and the more recognizable time after. Many cultures use such boundaries when they think about beginnings. A first age may be larger, longer, purer, stranger, or more dangerous than the world people know. That does not mean the details are literal records in the modern sense. It means the beginning carries a weight that ordinary events do not carry. In Mesopotamia, where people lived close to rivers that could nourish and destroy, a story of a great flood could mark a rupture in memory. It could divide the world of first kings from the world of later cities. For human beings, this kind of division answers a deep need. Our species has always lived with loss across generations. People die, voices disappear, buildings fall, fields change, rivers shift, and names fade. Yet communities try to hold a thread through that loss. They create stories that say there was a before, a break, and an after. The King List gives that pattern a royal shape. Before the flood, kingship has immense duration. After the flood, kingship returns and begins moving again through cities. The long reigns, then, may be less about one man's body and more about the imagined age of an institution. They may give the first kings a distance that later rulers could never have. A king who ruled for decades could be remembered by children and grandchildren. A king who ruled for thousands of years could only belong to a sacred past. That is why the pre-flood reigns remain so unsettling. They stand where history, legend, political memory, and human longing meet. They remind us that early writing did not simply record what happened. It also preserved the way people tried to make sense of an origin already slipping away from them. A reign of 28,000 years fails first against the body. Before it fails against history, before it fails against the habits of modern chronology, it fails against flesh. A human being is born helpless, grows slowly, depends on care, learns through many years, reaches strength, ages, weakens, and dies. This pattern is not a small detail. It is one of the deepest facts of our species. Our bones grow in stages, our teeth erupt and wear, our joints carry labour, our wounds heal imperfectly or not at all. Our lives are shaped by food, infection, childbirth, accident, weather, violence, and the simple wearing down of tissue over time. Ancient Mesopotamians were not exempt from these limits. They lived in a world of mud brick, grain, canals, animals, tools, festivals, and rulers, but their bodies remained human bodies. That is why the enormous reigns before the flood cannot be treated as ordinary lifespans without leaving accepted evidence behind. The numbers do not fit the scale of one organism. They do not fit the scale of one household, one remembered elder, or even a chain of direct witnesses. They move beyond biology and enter another kind of time. To feel the distance clearly, it helps to think in generations. A long-lived person may become a bridge between children and grandparents. An elder can remember voices that younger people never heard. A community can carry stories across several generations through repetition and ritual, yet even living memory has a horizon. Names become uncertain, events are simplified, places are renamed, grief turns into tradition. At the beginning of human society, before writing, this generational chain was the main way the past survived. Knowledge moved through bodies: how to find water, how to make tools, how to bury the dead, how to recognize danger, how to belong. But 28,000 years is not a memory held by elders. It is not a family story stretched a little longer. It is a time span deep enough to swallow countless births and deaths. It is closer to the scale on which cultures transform, landscapes change, languages vanish, and whole ways of living are replaced. That gap is the key. When the King List gives such a number to a ruler, it is not behaving like a normal biography. It is making the first age of kingship stand outside the reach of ordinary human transmission. The body cannot carry it. The family cannot carry it. Only a sacred or symbolic memory can try to carry it. This does not mean the number has no meaning. It means its meaning probably does not lie in the pulse of one living king. The very impossibility may be doing the work. It tells the listener that the pre-flood rulers belong to an age too distant to be compared with recent kings. Later, rulers can be placed nearer to political memory, conflict, dynasty, and city life. The earliest rulers are placed in a depth where time itself becomes part of their authority. Their reigns are vast because the beginning they represent is vast. Human communities often use scale in this way. A mountain can make a place feel sacred. A ruin can make a past feel heavy. A great number can make an origin feel unreachable. In the Sumerian King List, biological impossibility may be precisely what separates the first kings from ordinary rulers. They are not simply old. They belong to a time before normal historical distance begins. This is why the comparison with the human body is so important. It does not solve the list, but it keeps the interpretation honest. The long reigns should not be used to claim a lost biology or a hidden race of near-immortal humans. They should be heard as signs that early civilization was thinking with a different scale, using number to place kingship beyond the short breath of human life and beyond the fragile chain of remembered generations. If the reigns before the flood cannot be read as lifespans, then their purpose must be sought elsewhere. This is the careful place where the Sumerian King List asks us to pause. The numbers are too large for the body, too large for direct memory, and too large for any ordinary royal career. Yet they were not meaningless marks scattered without design. They appear in a tradition that arranges cities, names, rulers, and describes the movement of kingship through time. The safer question is not how one man could live that long, but what kind of memory needed numbers that large. One possibility is that the numbers help mark the first age as sacred distance. The earliest kings stood before the flood, before the later world of more familiar cities, before the past could be handled with the same confidence as inscriptions, buildings, or political events closer to historical reach. By giving them immense reigns, the list may have placed them beyond normal comparison. A later king could rule for years that people might remember. A first king could rule for a span that only tradition could hold. This is not a failure of ancient thought. It is a different use of time. From the beginning of human life in groups, people needed ways to speak about what came before living witnesses. A community could remember grandparents, perhaps great-grandparents, and a chain of stories older than any single voice. But origins always move farther away than memory can follow. When speech no longer reaches them, culture fills the distance with patterns, sacred names, first events, and measures larger than experience. In Mesopotamia, the King List turned that deep distance into royal time. The large numbers may also have served the authority of kingship itself. If rule began with ordinary men ruling ordinary lifetimes, then kingship might appear recent, fragile, and open to question. If rule began in an age where kings endured for thousands of years, then kingship seems ancient, almost woven into the structure of the world. The number does not need to be literal in order to strengthen that effect. It makes authority feel heavy with age. It gives later rulers a past that extends behind them like a long shadow. At the same time, the flood creates a boundary. The old world ends, kingship returns, and the list continues. The effect is not simple chronology, it is a way of shaping loss. Something existed before, something was broken, and something began again. Human beings have long used such patterns to survive the disappearance of earlier worlds. A river changes course, a settlement is abandoned, a language shifts, a ruling house falls, children grow up among ruins whose full meaning is already fading. The story of a before and an after helps a society carry loss without letting the thread break completely. This is why the unanswered nature of the numbers matters. If we claim too much, the list becomes a false marvel. If we dismiss too much, it becomes a dead curiosity. Held carefully, it becomes evidence of a more subtle truth. Early written civilization was not only recording rulers, but arranging the human need for beginnings. The pre-flood rains may be telling us that the origin of kingship had to feel older than any body, older than any remembered voice, older than any city's present claim. They preserve the distance between human life as it is lived and authority as it was imagined. That distance sits at the root of many early traditions, where social order, ancestry, and sacred memory try to reach beyond death and forgetting. The 28,000-year reign remains unexplained as literal history, but it becomes meaningful as a sign of what early Mesopotamian memory was trying to protect. It was not preserving immortality. It was preserving the feeling that the world of rule began somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary measured time. Numbers in Mesopotamia were not casual marks. They belonged to a trained world of accounting, measuring, teaching, building, astronomy, trade, labor, and temple administration. The people who produced and copied traditions like the Sumerian King List came from cultures that could handle numbers with real sophistication. This is important because the long reigns should not be explained away, as if ancient scribes simply did not know how to count. Southern Mesopotamia used a numerical tradition that included a base 60 system, a way of working with quantities that later left traces in how people measured time and circles. Scribes could record deliveries, calculate areas, manage rations, and preserve lists with practical care. They lived in societies where numbers mattered, because numbers organized food, work, land, offerings, and authority. A mistake could affect storage, payment, labor, or status. So when a text gives a ruler a reign that reaches into tens of thousands of years, the first responsible reaction is not to laugh at ancient ignorance. It is to ask what kind of number is being used, and for what purpose. A grain number and a sacred number may both be written with signs, but they do not always serve the same kind of truth. One measures a quantity to be managed. The other may measure distance, dignity, or the imagined depth of a beginning. Human beings have used numbers in both ways for a very long time. At the earliest levels of human life, long before clay tablets, counting was tied to bodies and survival. Fingers, days of travel, animals seen, people in a group, food remaining, seasons returning. Number began close to need. But as societies grew, number moved beyond immediate survival. It became a language for order. In Mesopotamia, it could count barley, but it could also support calendars, rituals, building plans, and royal memory. The Sumerian King List stands within that wider numerical world. Its immense reigns are written in a culture capable of practical calculation, which makes them more mysterious, not less. Some have wondered whether the numbers come from older systems, symbolic patterns, scribal conventions, or ways of magnifying the pre-flood past. Such ideas can be considered carefully, but none should be turned into a final answer too quickly. There is no single explanation accepted by all scholars that reduces every long reign to a simple conversion or error. It is tempting to imagine that one hidden formula will make the impossible reigns suddenly normal, turning thousands of years into ordinary lifetimes. But ancient texts rarely surrender so neatly. A number in a royal tradition may carry several meanings at once. It may belong partly to mathematics, partly to ideology, partly to sacred imagination, and partly to inherited narrative. The same number can appear exact while serving a purpose larger than exactness. This is difficult for a modern mind, because modern record-keeping often separates practical data from symbolic language. Mesopotamian writing did not always make that separation in the same way. The tablet could be precise, But precision did not always mean modern historical literalism. A very large reign could tell the listener that an early king belonged to an age of vast authority, before the flood and before the nearer political world. It could make the origin of rule feel old enough to stand beyond ordinary challenge. The number becomes a tool of memory, not simply a measurement of metabolism. This careful distinction protects the honesty of the story. The long reigns do not prove impossible biology. They also do not prove that Mesopotamian scribes were careless. They show that one early civilization used numbers to join administration, sacred time, and political memory in ways still difficult for us to separate with modern minds, especially when those numbers were placed at the doorway between remembered cities and a beginning no living witness could reach, a beginning where human order was imagined before ordinary time became close enough to count. Several careful interpretations have been offered for the enormous reigns in the Sumerian King List, and the most honest way to present them is not as competing miracles, but as possible functions of an ancient tradition. One interpretation sees the numbers as symbolic. In this view, a reign of thousands of years does not describe the aging of a single body. It creates sacred distance. It tells the listener that the earliest rulers belong to an age unlike the present, an age placed before normal historical memory and before the flood that divides the list. The number becomes a way of making the beginning feel vast. Another interpretation looks at power. A ruler in a city of mud brick, canals, fields, storehouses, workers, priests and scribes did not need only soldiers. He needed legitimacy. He needed to appear connected to an order older than his own ambition. If kingship could be imagined as descending from heaven and moving through cities, then the first kings had to be more than ordinary leaders. Very long reigns could make the institution of kingship seem ancient beyond challenge, as if rule itself had existed before any present city could claim to have created it. A third approach pays attention to number patterns and scribal habits. Mesopotamian scribes worked within a learned numerical culture, and large numbers could carry formal beauty, inherited convention, or sacred weight. Some reign lengths may reflect traditional numerical schemes rather than direct observation, yet this must be said carefully. It is not enough to announce a simple code and pretend the problem is solved. The surviving tradition is varied, and no single conversion explains all the difficult numbers in a way that satisfies every question. Another approach looks at cycles of time. Ancient cultures often imagined the deep past through repeated ages, turns, ruptures, renewals and returns. The flood in the King List creates one of those great breaks. Before it, time is stretched. After it, kingship begins again. The numbers may help separate one kind of time from another, marking an earlier world as grander, stranger and farther away. This is not proof that the pre-flood world existed exactly as described. It is evidence that the tradition organized memory around a boundary of loss and renewal. A further interpretation sees the list as royal literature, not a neutral archive. It arranges cities into a sequence and turns political competition into an ordered story. In real history, power rarely moves so neatly. Cities rise unevenly, overlap, fight, trade, decline, recover, and remember themselves differently. A list can smooth that confusion. It can make authority appear to travel along a single road. In that literary and political design, the long reigns help create the depth at the beginning of the road. They make the first stage feel remote enough to support everything that follows. There is also the possibility that these explanations were never separate for the people who preserved the tradition. A sacred number could also be a political number. A political sequence could also carry ritual meaning. A remembered city could sit beside a legendary duration without the copyist feeling the need to divide them into modern categories. All of these interpretations share one careful point. The numbers mean something, even if they are not literal lifespans. They show that early written civilization was not merely counting years, it was organizing human memory. From the older origin of our species, memory had always been shaped by need. People remembered paths, seasons, tools, graves, dangers, and kin. In the first cities, that memory expanded into lists, temples, rulers, and written traditions. The King List may preserve a moment when human beings tried to give political order a past deeper than the human body could carry, and deeper than any single generation could safely test. The 28,000-year reign remains unresolved, but it points toward a culture using number as symbol, authority, rhythm, and memory at once. The most careful answer to the long reigns is also the least dramatic. There is no single explanation that can honestly close the question. The Sumerian King List has been studied for generations, and many approaches help us understand it better, but none turns every impossible number into ordinary history. The 28,000-year reigns cannot be accepted as biological lifespans, because the human body does not provide room for such a claim. They cannot be dismissed as simple stupidity, because Mesopotamian scribes belong to a culture deeply skilled in record-keeping, calculation, and inherited learning. They cannot be reduced safely to one hidden formula, because the surviving tradition is too layered and too uneven to be solved by one neat conversion. What remains is a more patient form of knowledge. The list tells us that early Mesopotamian memory joined real cities, sacred beginnings, political legitimacy, and numerical magnitude in a way that still resists clean separation. That resistance is not a failure of the story, it is the story. Human beings often want the past to become simpler as we study it, but ancient evidence does not always move towards simplicity. Sometimes the closer we come to a tablet, a ruin, or a name, the more we see the boundaries of what can be known. The beginning of written civilization was not a laboratory of modern history. It was a human world of temples, fields, rivers, rulers, scribes, families, laborers, grief, ambition, and sacred expectation. In that world, a number could count barley with practical accuracy, and a number could also make the first age of kingship feel immeasurably far away. Both uses belong to the same broad human effort to protect order from forgetting. This is why honesty requires more than saying the reigns are false. It requires asking what kind of truth the list was trying to preserve. A literal truth about one man's lifespan is almost certainly not supported. A cultural truth about the imagined depth of authority is much more plausible. A political truth about cities competing for a place in remembered time is also plausible. A sacred truth about rule descending from beyond ordinary life may have been central to the tradition. These possibilities can stand together without becoming a final answer. They form a field of interpretation, not a solved equation. The origin of humanity helps us understand why such a field exists. Our species survived by carrying memory forward, but memory was never only a storehouse of exact events. It was also a way of making danger meaningful, making ancestors present, making land familiar, and making group life durable. When humans built cities, the same mental habit entered a larger frame. Memory had to support institutions. It had to justify obedience among people who did not all know one another. It had to give present rule an older ground. The King List may show that transition in a particularly clear and strange form. Clay made memory harder, but it did not make memory purely modern. It preserved the older human need to begin before the beginning, to place society under a sky of inherited meaning. The long reigns remain unexplained because they sit exactly where evidence, imagination, and authority meet. If we demand certainty, we will either invent too much or erase too much. If we stay with the uncertainty, the list becomes more valuable. It teaches us that some ancient texts are not puzzles with one missing key. They are records of how people lived with questions larger than their evidence. They remind us that early civilization did not only ask what happened before us, but also how a fragile community could feel protected by a past deeper than any living memory could reach. The 28,000-year reigns still stand on the clay as impossible time, and their silence may be the most truthful thing they give us. In the Sumerian King List, the flood is more than a violent event placed in the middle of a story. It acts like a hinge in time. Before it, kingship belongs to a remote world where reigns stretch into thousands of years and the first rulers stand almost beyond ordinary human comparison. After it, kingship returns, and the list begins again in a world that slowly feels closer to the political memory of cities, dynasties, and human scale. This does not mean the later material is simple modern history, and it does not mean the earlier material is worthless. The flood creates a line between two kinds of remembered time. On one side is sacred distance, where origins are vast and difficult to measure. On the other side is a world still ancient, still layered with legend, but gradually more connected to the city life that archaeology and inscriptions can sometimes approach. That line is one reason the text feels so powerful. It does not merely say that a disaster happened. It says that memory itself was broken and then restarted. For people living in southern Mesopotamia, water was never only background. It made the fields possible, filled canals, carried boats, left fertile silt, and sustained cities of mud, brick, and grain. But water also threatened boundaries. It could rise too far, damage fields, erase markers, weaken walls, and turn ordered ground back into uncertainty. In such a landscape, a flood could become a natural image for the collapse of order. It could stand for more than water. It could stand for the loss of names, the ending of a world, and the need to begin again. This connects deeply with the older human condition. Long before writing, human groups remembered dangerous waters, broken camps, changed rivers, storms, droughts, migrations, and places where life had once been possible but no longer was. Survival depended on remembering such breaks. A community that forgot where danger had come from could suffer again. A community that remembered only terror could fail to rebuild. The human mind needed a way to hold both loss and return. The King List gives that pattern a royal shape. Kingship exists before the flood. The flood overwhelms the world of first kings. Then kingship descends again, and the cities after the flood receive their turns. The message is not merely chronological. It is structural. It tells the listener that authority can be interrupted but not erased completely. A city may fall, a ruling house may vanish, and a generation may lose the names of those before it. Yet the idea of order can return under a new name and in a new place. The pre-flood reigns become even more distant because they stand on the far side of this rupture. Their enormous numbers do not just magnify individual rulers. They magnify the lost world itself. If a king before the flood ruled for an impossible span, then the age before the flood is not simply old, it is almost unreachable. The flood makes that unreachable quality stronger by placing a break between that world and everything that follows. This is why the flood should be treated carefully. It should not be turned into simple proof of a single global flood in the modern geological sense. It should not be used to make claims that evidence cannot support. What can be said more safely is that Mesopotamian tradition preserved the flood as a boundary of memory, a way to speak about destruction, renewal, and the fragile continuity of rule. At the beginning of written civilization, people were not only recording who ruled, they were asking how order could survive interruption. They were asking how a world made of mud, water, labour, and breath could lose its shape and still find a pattern again. In that quiet sense, the flood in the King List is not only an event behind the text, it is the line that makes the impossible reigns belong to a before and makes every later city inherit an after. The flood in the Sumerian King List has to be handled with care because it stands close to one of the most powerful images in human memory, water covering the known world. It is easy to take that image and make it larger than the evidence allows. Many cultures have flood traditions, including Mesopotamian stories connected with figures such as Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim. These traditions are historically significant because they show that people living near rivers understood water as both life and danger. They do not, by themselves, prove that one single flood covered the entire planet. A listener must keep those two ideas apart. The tradition is real. The memory of water in river societies is understandable. But the leap from an ancient story to a universal scientific event is not something the evidence allows us to make simply. Southern Mesopotamia was a place where floods could be local or regional and still feel like the end of the world to those who endured them. A community does not need to see the whole planet underwater in order to experience the destruction of its whole world. If fields vanish, houses collapse, stored grain is ruined, graves are disturbed, animals drown, and families are scattered, the known order has ended for the people standing there. Their world has been broken, even if distant lands remain untouched. Ancient people did not describe disaster from satellites or modern global measurement. They described it from the horizon of human life. The horizon of a farmer, a canal worker, a mother, a scribe, or a child was the city. The fields, the river, the road, the temple, the neighbours, and the dead who belonged to that ground. When water erased that horizon, memory could turn it into a boundary between before and after. That does not make the memory false, it makes it human. From the earliest periods of our species, danger was remembered through lived scale, not planetary scale. A storm that destroyed a camp, a river that cut off a path, a drought that emptied a valley, or a flood that swallowed a settlement could become a story carried for generations. Such stories help people survive by teaching caution, humility, and the fragile nature of place. In Mesopotamia, that older human habit entered written tradition. The flood became not only an event of water, but a way to speak about the collapse and return of order. In the King List, kingship exists before the flood, is interrupted by it, and then descends again. The line is not a scientific report. It is a memory structure. It tells us how a culture imagined rupture. It also shows why the long reigns before the flood should not be separated from the flood itself. Those reigns belong to a world placed beyond the break. They are distant not only because their numbers are enormous, but because the flood cuts them off from continuity. After the flood, memory begins again in a changed world. This pattern does not require us to deny that real floods affected Mesopotamian communities. Archaeology has found evidence of flood deposits at some sites, though such evidence is local, uneven, and not proof of one worldwide event. That careful statement is enough. It allows the tradition to remain meaningful without turning it into false certainty. The Sumerian King List is strongest when we let it be what it appears to be. A preserved ancient attempt to arrange kingship, loss, and renewal across time. Its flood is a boundary of human memory, shaped by a landscape where water could feed a city and take it apart. Its long reigns are not proof of impossible lives. They are part of a way of saying that the first age of rule stood on the far side of a remembered rupture, where time had become too old, too sacred to measure like an ordinary rain. For communities living close to the rivers of southern Mesopotamia, water was never only a physical substance. It was a teacher of limits. It gave fertility, but it also reminded people that order could be temporary. A canal could be cleared by careful hands, a field could be measured, a storage room could be filled, a city wall could rise from mud brick, and still a season of too much water could disturb the pattern. This is why flood memory belongs so naturally beside the question of kingship. The Sumerian King List does not place the flood as an isolated disaster with no meaning around it. It places it between worlds. Before the flood, kingship has an almost immeasurable depth. After the flood, kingship returns and begins again among cities that stand closer to the known political world. For people who lived by rivers, such a structure would have made emotional and social sense. Water could erase the visible signs of order, but the community still needed to believe that order could be restored. Human beings have carried this need since the earliest origins of social life. Long before written cities, groups had to remember where water was safe, where it was dangerous, where the ground softened, where animals gathered, where people had died, and where return was possible. Memory was not a luxury, it was part of survival. A story about water could teach caution. A story about loss could help a group remain steady after fear. A story about return could give the living a path when the old ground no longer looked the same. In Mesopotamia, that ancient human habit was placed into the language of kingship. The flood became a way to speak about the fragility of cities, the interruption of rule, and the strange persistence of authority after collapse. This does not require us to turn the flood into a modern global event. It asks us to see how local or regional disaster, when experienced by a whole community, could become a total break in memory. The known world of a city was not the planet. It was the river, the fields, the temple, the family house, the graves, the roads, the stored grain, and the names attached to them. If water took those things, then the world that mattered had been undone. The King List preserves that kind of human scale. It imagines kingship surviving a rupture that no single ruler could survive. That idea connects directly to the impossible reigns. The pre-flood kings are placed on the far side of a break, so deep that ordinary time cannot cross it easily. Their years become vast because the world they belong to is lost. Their reigns do not have to describe the heartbeat of one living body. They may describe a distance created by loss, a time made larger because memory can no longer touch it directly. This is a familiar movement in human thought. When the beginning is gone, people often make it larger. When ancestors are no longer known by face or voice, they may become founders. When a ruined place can no longer explain itself, it may become sacred. When a disaster divides before from after, the time before it may grow strange in the mind. Early civilization inherited this older human way of remembering, then fixed it in clay. The flood in the Sumerian King List therefore gives the long reigns a boundary. It tells the listener that the first kings belonged to a world not merely old, but separated from the present by destruction. After the waters, kingship returns, and with it comes the hope that order can begin again. That hope may be the quiet center of the tradition, not that humans once escaped biology, but that human communities, knowing how easily their world could be broken, still tried to carry authority, memory, and meaning across the flood line. After the flood, the Sumerian King List begins to feel as if it is walking slowly toward firmer ground. The text does not suddenly become simple history, and it should not be treated as if every name and reign can now be accepted without question. But the atmosphere changes. The enormous pre-flood distances begin to give way to cities and rulers that stand closer to the world of archaeology, inscriptions, and political memory. Kingship descends again, and the sequence continues through places that belong to the real landscape of Mesopotamia. Kish, Uruk, Ur, and other cities were not empty names floating in myth. They were urban centers with temples, walls, fields, craft production, rivalries, and memories of power. This is where the King List becomes especially difficult, because myth does not end cleanly and history does not begin all at once. They overlap. A ruler may appear in a royal tradition shaped by legend, while the city attached to him may be known from material remains. A name may stand near the edge of independent evidence, while the story around that name may still carry literary or sacred weight. The listener has to move carefully, neither accepting everything nor dismissing everything. After the flood, the list seems to bring kingship back into a world where human institutions become easier to imagine. Rulers with courts, cities competing for prestige, temples receiving offerings, scribes preserving names, and communities trying to place themselves inside a shared past. This movement matters because it shows that the impossible reigns before the flood are not the whole story. The King List is not only a collection of strange numbers, it is a bridge between different kinds of memory. On one side are the first kings, whose reigns stretch so far beyond the body that they belong to sacred distance. On the other side are cities whose traces can sometimes be approached through ruins, inscriptions, and later traditions. Between them is the flood, the great rupture that divides before from after. Human beings have often remembered the past in this layered way. At the beginning of our social life, memory was never a clean archive. It was a mixture of event, emotion, warning, place, ancestry, and meaning. A dangerous river crossing could become a story, a respected ancestor could become a founder, a ruined settlement could become a sign of loss. When cities developed writing, these older habits did not disappear. They entered tablets, lists, and royal traditions. The post-flood world of the King List therefore gives us a chance to see memory becoming denser. It is no longer only the sacred vastness of origins, it begins to touch the political world of human settlements, where power could be held, lost, remembered, and claimed. This does not make the list a modern timeline. The reigns after the flood may still be exaggerated, arranged, simplified, or shaped by royal ideology. Political power in real life rarely moves as neatly as a list suggests. Cities can overlap in influence. Dynasties can compete at the same time. Later scribes can preserve one tradition while leaving another silent. Yet the movement toward more recognizable cities is meaningful. It suggests that the text was trying to connect the deepest past with the remembered past, to make the world after catastrophe feel joined to the world before it. The question of kings who ruled for 28,000 years becomes sharper here. If the list were pure fantasy, the return to known cities would matter less. If it were pure history, the impossible years would have to be erased. Its power lies in the fact that both remain together. The clay holds a memory in which real urban life and sacred time are woven into the same royal sequence. After the flood, we begin to see why early civilization needed such a sequence, not only to know who ruled, but to believe that order had survived the break, crossed into human cities again, and left enough traces for later hands to press into clay. Archaeology, ancient writing, and royal tradition do not speak in the same voice. Archaeology speaks through walls, pottery, graves, tools, food remains, flood deposits, ceilings, and the slow pattern of settlement on the ground. It rarely gives a complete sentence. It gives traces, and those traces must be compared carefully. Ancient writing speaks more directly, but not always more simply. A clay tablet can name a king, a city, a temple, or an offering, yet the purpose of the writing matters. Was it an account, a school exercise, a royal claim, a hymn, a list, a legal record, or a tradition copied because it carried prestige? Royal tradition speaks with another pressure again. It often wants order, legitimacy, and memory. It may preserve real names and real places, but it can arrange them in ways that serve authority. The Sumerian King List stands where these voices meet. Its cities belong to a world that archaeology can sometimes touch, but its sequence is not identical with the full, uneven reality of political life. Its rulers may carry echoes of historical memory, but some reign lengths and early settings belong to a more legendary horizon. This difference is essential for staying honest. A ruined wall does not automatically prove every story told about the city. A written name does not automatically prove every number attached to that name. A royal sequence does not automatically mean that only one city held power at a time in the complex reality of Mesopotamian politics. Early cities could overlap, compete, ally, collapse, and remember themselves through different traditions. The list smooths that difficult world into a single road of kingship. That smoothing is meaningful, but it is not the same as a neutral map. Human memory has always worked with traces in this way. At the origin of our species' social life, people did not inherit the past as a perfect archive. They inherited bones, paths, tools, scars, stories, and places that had to be interpreted. A footprint could mean danger. A grave could mean belonging. A ruined shelter could mean loss, warning, or return. Meaning was made by joining evidence with memory. In the first written civilizations, that older habit did not vanish. It became more durable and more political. A city could preserve its place in time through tablets and names, while rulers could use that preserved time to support present claims. This is why the King List must be read as neither pure evidence nor pure invention. It is a constructed memory, and constructed memory can contain real material. The careful question is always, what kind of reality is being preserved? Sometimes it is the reality of a place. Sometimes it is the reality of an institution. Sometimes it is the reality of a belief about authority. Sometimes it is a political arrangement of the past that later scribes found useful to copy. The enormous reigns before the flood belong to this same problem. They are not supported as literal human lifespans, but they are supported as evidence that the beginning of kingship was imagined on a scale beyond ordinary experience. After the flood, when the list moves nearer to recognizable cities, the problem becomes more subtle. The clay may carry historical echoes, but echoes are not the same as a full voice. Archaeology can confirm that a city existed, but it cannot always confirm the exact story a tradition tells about kingship moving there. Writing can preserve a name, but it cannot always tell us how memory changed before that name was written. Royal tradition can offer a sequence, but it can also compress, omit, and dignify. The value of the Sumerian King List lies in this tension. It gives us a rare view of early civilization trying to join ground, text, and authority into one remembered past, while still leaving us with the quiet responsibility to separate what can be known from what was believed. The Sumerian King List remains most truthful when it is allowed to stand in the borderland where myth begins to touch history. It is not a door that opens straight into the factual past, and it is not a curtain painted only with dreams. It is something more difficult, a preserved memory from a culture that did not divide sacred origin, political order, and civic identity in the same way a modern reader might. In its earliest horizons, kingship belongs to a time almost unreachable, marked by reigns too vast for the human body and divided from later memory by the flood. Yet as the sequence continues, names of cities and rulers move closer to landscapes where archaeology, inscriptions, and later traditions can sometimes offer comparison. This gradual change is important. It shows that the list was not simply inventing a world without attachment to the ground. It was arranging remembered places within a larger story of authority. A real city could become more than a settlement. It could become a resting place of kingship. A ruler could become more than a man. He could become a marker in the movement of power through time. But that does not make every reign-length sequence or claim a modern historical fact. The clay preserves a mixture, and the mixture must remain visible. Human beings have lived with such mixtures from the beginning. Long before writing, a group could know a valley through direct experience and still surround that valley with stories of ancestors, danger, or first arrival. A stone tool was practical, but it could also belong to memory. A burial was a physical act, but it also carried meaning beyond the body. A path across a landscape could be both geography and inheritance. The first written cities did not abandon this older human habit, they intensified it. Now a city could fix its memory in signs, and those signs could make political identity endure longer than speech. The King List stands inside that intensification. It takes the old human need for origin and places it into an urban language of rulers, cities, succession, and divine order. This is why the text cannot be reduced to one simple label. Its mythic material gives the origin of kingship sacred depth. Its historical echoes anchor that depth to known places. Its royal structure turns many competing cities into a single line of remembered power. The result is not neutral history, but neither is it useless imagination. It is a bridge, though not a smooth one. Some stones are firm, some are symbolic, some are missing, some may have been set there by scribes to support later claims. To cross it honestly, the listener must move slowly. The enormous rains before the flood should be heard as impossible in biological terms, but meaningful within a memory of sacred beginnings. The cities after the flood should be taken seriously as part of Mesopotamia's real landscape, while still being read through the political intentions of a royal tradition. That balance is the value of the list. It shows how early civilization tried to connect fragile human settlements to time so deep that no living witness could carry it. At the root of this effort is the same condition that shaped our species from its earliest communities: a short life looking for a longer beginning. A person dies, a ruler dies, a city may fall, but a written sequence can make authority appear to continue across rupture, loss, and forgetting. The Sumerian King List survives because it holds that desire in clay. It does not give us a clean answer to the 28,000-year reigns. It gives us a more human puzzle, why the first written memories of power needed both real cities and impossible time together inside one fragile shape of memory that still asks us to listen without forcing certainty or closing the question. Civilizations do not only remember the past because they are curious. They remember the past because the present feels unstable without roots beneath it. A city made of mud brick, grain stores, canals, temples, families, and rulers can look solid in daylight, yet every part of it is temporary. Walls crack, rivers shift, harvests fail, kings die. Children grow up without hearing the voices that once explained why things were done a certain way. Under that pressure, societies often make time larger than life. They stretch their beginnings backward, not always to deceive, but to give the living a sense that their world did not appear by accident. The Sumerian King List is one of the oldest and strangest examples of this human movement. It places cities inside a royal sequence, then pushes the origin of kingship into a distance so great that normal human measure breaks down. The 28,000-year reigns are not convincing as biological lifespans, but they are powerful as signs of a past made deliberately deep. A ruler who belongs only to yesterday can be challenged as a temporary man. A ruler who stands inside a chain reaching back before the flood, before familiar memory, and before ordinary time begins to feel like the carrier of something older than himself. This is not unique to Mesopotamia, though Mesopotamia gives it an early written form. Human communities have long used the past to stabilize the present. At the beginning of our species' social life, groups survived by remembering where they came from, which paths were safe, which ancestors mattered, and which dangers had nearly destroyed them. Those memories help people cooperate beyond the immediate moment. In a city, the same need grew heavier. People who did not know one another personally still had to share labor, obey signals, accept measures, trust officials, honor temples, and understand why one city could claim kingship over another. A long past made that order feel less fragile. It told the living that they were not standing on loose ground, but on layers of remembered authority. This is why large time can become a political tool. It does not have to describe events exactly in order to shape behavior. A deep beginning gives weight to the present. A sacred first age gives dignity to later rule. A sequence of cities makes competition look like destiny rather than accident. The King List arranges the messy world of early Mesopotamian power into a single movement of kingship. In real life, cities could overlap in influence, fight, trade, recover, and decline unevenly. But a list can make that complexity appear ordered. It can say that kingship was here, then there, then elsewhere. The enormous reigns at the beginning make the whole road seem ancient beyond ordinary argument. They turn the first rulers into markers of a time no living generation can test. That is where the numbers do their quiet work. They create distance. They make the origin difficult to touch. They protect the beginning from the ordinary questions that might be asked of recent kings. The farther back the chain reaches, the more the present ruler seems to inherit rather than invent. This does not mean the scribes were inventing without purpose. It means they were writing within a world where authority, memory, and sacred order were joined. The beginning of human civilization was not only a practical change in food or settlement, it was also a change in how people imagined belonging across time. Once communities became large enough to outlive direct memory, they needed a past that could outlast bodies. Clay tablets help preserve that past, but they also preserve the human desire to make beginnings grand enough to hold the present. The Sumerian King List records impossible time because early civilization may have needed a past too large to be owned by any single ruler, city, generation, or brief political victory alone. A city is made of many lifetimes, but no single lifetime can contain the city. This is one of the quiet pressures behind the Sumerian King List. Every ruler dies, every worker ages, every scribe's hand eventually stops, yet the city wants to imagine itself as continuing. It wants to believe that the wall repaired by one generation, the canal cleared by another, the temple maintained by another, and the name of kingship carried by another all belong to a single story. Without that larger story, urban life can feel like a chain of brief efforts scattered across time. A population is never a fixed body. Children are born into names they did not choose. Adults inherit fields, duties, debts, rituals, and fears from people already gone. Elders carry memories that younger people must accept without having seen them. Then those elders disappear, and the younger people become the keepers of a past that is already thinning. In small communities, this movement across generations can remain close to faces and voices. Someone remembers a grandparent. Someone knows who first cleared a path, where a burial lies, or why a certain place is avoided. But in a city, the population becomes too large and too layered for memory to remain intimate. Many people share an order whose beginning they never saw. They work inside institutions older than themselves. They obey names written before they were born. They live among buildings, repaired so many times that no living person remembers the first brick. The King List answers that condition by giving kingship a lineage longer than any household. It turns political memory into a chain that can outlast the bodies inside it. The impossible rains before the flood exaggerate this need until it becomes visible. A reign of 28,000 years cannot belong to one human organism, but it can make the beginning of rule appear older than all ordinary generations combined. It transforms kingship from an event into an inheritance beyond personal memory. At the origin of human society, continuity was always fragile. Our ancestors survived because knowledge passed from one body to another. How to prepare food, where to find water, which animals were dangerous, how to raise children, how to bury the dead, how to remain inside a group. That passing was never perfect. Memory could be lost. A small population could suffer from famine, conflict, migration, or disease, and with each loss, some knowledge could fade. When people later lived in cities, the risk of forgetting changed shape. The danger was no longer only that a path or tool would be forgotten. The danger was that the social order itself might seem temporary, without a beginning strong enough to command loyalty. A very long past helped solve that emotional and political problem. It told each generation that it was not inventing the world again. It was receiving a world already heavy with time. This may be why civilizations often make their origins larger than life. A brief community needs a long memory because the lives inside it are short. A ruler needs predecessors because his own reign is only a narrow span. A city needs founders because its present walls cannot explain themselves. The Sumerian King List gives that need a Mesopotamian shape. Kingship moves from city to city, while the earliest rulers stand in a depth unreachable by normal memory. The population living under later kings could see itself as belonging to a chain that began before the flood and survived beyond disaster. That idea does not prove the literal numbers. It explains why the numbers could matter. They make generations feel connected to a beginning too old to be challenged by any one generation. They give a short-lived human community the feeling of standing inside a time that does not die when its people do. In the end, the large reigns may reveal less about the bodies of ancient kings than about the fear every civilization carries quietly within it. That without a past vast enough to hold it, the present may feel too brief to trust. Human beings do not remember only to store facts. We remember because memory gives shape to where we stand. A name, a ruin, a grave, a riverbank, or a line of rulers can tell a community that its life is part of something wider than the present hour. The Sumerian King List belongs to this deeper habit. It does not only say that certain rulers came before others, it shows how one of the first urban societies tried to understand its position in time. The list begins with kingship descending, moves through cities, crosses the boundary of the flood, and continues into a world closer to historical memory. In doing so, it turns human life into a sequence much larger than the body. A person lives briefly. A city lasts longer, but not forever. A tradition, if copied, can outlive both. This may be why the long reigns matter even when they cannot be taken as literal lifespans. They reveal a desire to place the present inside a beginning deep enough to explain it. The question is not only what the scribes believed happened, it is also why such a shape of time felt necessary. At the origin of human society, survival depended on practical memory, but meaning followed closely behind. A group needed to know where to find food, when to move, how to avoid danger, and whom to trust. Yet people also needed to know who they were in relation to the dead, to the land, and to one another. This second need became stronger as communities grew. In a city, identity could no longer depend only on direct kinship or personal memory. Thousands of people shared a world too large for face-to-face trust. They needed signs, rituals, institutions, and stories that could hold them together. The King List gave one answer. It said, in effect, that the political world had a memory older than any living person. Kingship did not begin yesterday. It descended, endured, was interrupted, and returned. The present was therefore not an accident floating alone. It belonged to a long movement of authority across time. The immense numbers before the flood helped give that movement depth. They made the first age difficult to approach, and that difficulty may have been part of its force. A beginning that can be easily measured can also be easily questioned. A beginning placed beyond normal measurement feels protected by distance. This does not make the numbers historically literal. It makes them culturally revealing. They show that early civilization used time to answer a human unease. How can a fragile society trust itself when every person inside it is temporary? The answer on clay was not scientific in the modern sense. It was a pattern of belonging. It placed rulers, cities, disaster, and renewal into one memory, so that later generations could feel themselves connected to a line that did not end with their own deaths. That need has never fully disappeared. Even modern people, with clocks, archives, and scientific dating, still ask where we began and why the beginning matters. We are drawn to origin stories because they reduce the loneliness of the present. They tell us that we did not arrive without a path behind us. The Sumerian King List is ancient, but the human feeling inside it remains recognizable. It stands at the edge of written history and quietly shows that people were not only counting years. They were trying to understand what it meant to live after others, before others, and among others, inside a time too large for one mind to hold. The kings who ruled for 28,000 years may never be explained as ordinary history, but the need that preserved them is clear enough to feel. The need to make human life belong to a past larger than loss, larger than memory, and larger than the silence that waits when names finally disappear. What can be said with confidence about the Sumerian King List is narrower than the mystery around it, but that narrow ground matters. The tradition is real. It is known from ancient Mesopotamian writing, preserved through clay tablets and later scribal copies, not from a modern invention or a recent fantasy. It belongs to a world where scribes learned signs, copied older material, and helped institutions remember what living voices could not carry alone. The cities named in the tradition also belong to the real historical and geographical world of southern Mesopotamia. Eridu, Kish, Uruk, Ura, and other places were not empty scenery created only to decorate a tale. They were remembered cities, some with archaeological traces, some with long cultural weight, all standing in a landscape of rivers, canals, mud brick, fields, temples, and human labour. The idea that the list contains real ancient material is therefore secure in a broad sense. The difficult question is what kind of ancient material it contains. A real text can preserve legend. A real city can be placed inside sacred memory. A real scribal tradition can arrange the past in a way that serves political meaning. This is why certainty has to be careful. The Sumerian King List is not false simply because it contains impossible reigns, and it is not literal modern history simply because it names real cities. It is a genuine witness to how early Mesopotamian culture remembered rule. It shows that kingship was imagined as something that could descend, rest in a city, pass to another city, vanish through disaster, and return. That structure is one of the things we can speak about responsibly. It tells us that authority was not remembered only as the career of one ruler. It was imagined as a force moving across time and place. The origin of human society helps explain why such a tradition could matter. Long before cities, people survived by carrying memory from one generation to another, where water could be found, how tools were made, where danger had come from, which dead belonged to the group, and which stories gave order to fear. When human beings began living in cities, that older burden of memory became larger and harder. A city needed records, rituals, names, and sequences. It needed ways to make many brief lives feel joined to one long existence. The King List belongs to that expanded memory. Another thing can be said with confidence. The long reigns were preserved by people capable of serious record-keeping. Mesopotamian scribes were not careless children of history. Their societies counted grain, assigned labour, measured land, recorded deliveries, and used writing for many practical needs. The presence of extraordinary numbers in a royal tradition should therefore be read as meaningful, not as proof of ignorance. Yet meaning is not the same as literal fact. The text can tell us that early scribes valued a deep and sacred past without proving that any king lived for thousands of years. It can show us the dignity given to ancient kingship without giving us a biological record of impossible bodies. It can connect remembered cities with vast time without allowing us to turn that vast time into a simple timeline. The safest knowledge is often layered. We can say that the King List is ancient. We can say that it was copied and preserved. We can say that it names cities rooted in Mesopotamian memory and landscape. We can say that it presents kingship as moving from city to city. We can say that its earliest reigns reach far beyond ordinary human life. We can also say that the exact reason for those reign lengths remains unresolved. Holding all of these statements together is more honest than choosing one extreme. At the beginning of written civilization, humanity did not suddenly become perfectly modern in its treatment of the past. Writing made memory more durable, but it also made older forms of meaning more durable. The clay kept accounts, but it also kept longing, legitimacy, sacred distance, and the fear of forgetting. What we can know, then, is enough to make the list important, even if it is not enough to make the 28,000-year reigns simple. There is also much that should not be claimed. The Sumerian King List should not be used to say that human beings once lived for tens of thousands of years. It should not be used to argue that an unknown race of near-immortal rulers governed the earth before ordinary history began. It should not be treated as a hidden scientific document proving a lost biology, a vanished technology, or a forgotten age that modern evidence has somehow failed to notice. Such claims may feel exciting for a moment, but they do not rest on accepted evidence. They also weaken the real value of the text by forcing it to answer questions it was probably never meant to answer. A reign of 28,000 years cannot be made into a normal human career. The body will not allow it. Human bones, teeth, joints, wounds, disease patterns, labour marks and burials all belong to lives shaped by growth, aging, injury, hunger and death. Ancient people were not outside the biological limits that define our species. They suffered, healed, aged and disappeared, like human beings before and after them. To say this clearly is not to make the King List less mysterious. It makes the mystery more honest. The puzzle is not whether one king's body survived for thousands of years. The puzzle is why a culture that knew how to count, record, copy, measure, and govern preserved such a number within a royal tradition. That question is deeper than a false marvel. It leads us back to the beginning of written civilization, and beyond that, to the older beginning of human memory itself. Our ancestors learned to survive by passing knowledge forward, where water could be found, how seasons changed, which places were dangerous, how tools were made, how the dead were remembered, and how a group could continue after loss. When city life appeared, that same need expanded. A city required more than living memory. It needed records that could outlast bodies. It needed stories that could make authority feel older than one ruler's strength. It needed a past deep enough to hold people who did not all know one another face to face. The long reigns may have helped create that depth, but they should not be confused with measured human lifespans. We should also avoid claiming that every detail of the King List is equally historical. Some cities named in the tradition can be approached through archaeology and other ancient sources, but that does not prove every sequence exactly as written. Some rulers may stand closer to historical memory than others, but that does not make the whole list a neutral timeline. Royal traditions often arrange the past in ways that serve authority. They can simplify messy political realities. They can make overlapping city powers look like a single orderly movement. They can preserve prestige, legitimacy, and sacred memory alongside names that may have belonged to real places and real rulers. This does not make them worthless. It means they must be read with patience. A clay tablet is not automatically a modern history book just because it is old and written. It has a purpose, a setting, and a worldview. The King List presents kingship as descending, moving, being interrupted, and returning. That pattern is meaningful, but it is not a license to invent certainty where evidence remains limited. We should also avoid reducing the long numbers to one simple trick. They may involve symbolism, sacred distance, numerical tradition, political ideology, or inherited literary pattern. They may have carried more than one meaning at the same time. But no responsible account should pretend that one neat explanation has solved the whole problem for everyone. The unanswered quality is part of what survives. At the root of the issue is a very human tension. A person is brief. A generation is brief. Even a city is fragile when measured against rivers, climate, war, abandonment, and forgetting. Yet human communities keep trying to place themselves inside a time larger than their own disappearance. The Sumerian King List is not proof that ancient kings escaped death. It is proof that early civilization could imagine authority reaching beyond the scale of death, and then preserve that imagination carefully enough for us to still be troubled by it. The central paradox now becomes sharper. Southern Mesopotamia was not a world unable to record ordinary things. Its scribes could write accounts, lists, measures, names, deliveries, rations, offerings, and royal claims. They belonged to societies that depended on careful memory, because careless memory could disturb food, labour, debt, worship, and authority. Clay tablets were not vague dreams. They were tools of order. They could hold a transaction after the spoken promise faded. They could let an institution remember when a worker, a priest, a farmer, or even a ruler was gone. Yet within that same written world, the Sumerian King List preserved reigns that reach beyond any human lifetime, beyond any chain of direct witnesses, beyond the scale of bodies and generations. Why would a culture skilled in keeping track of the practical choose to keep numbers that seem to break the practical frame? That is the question that remains when false certainty is removed. If the scribes were only confused, the list becomes too small. If the reigns were literal biology, the claim becomes unsupported. The more careful possibility is that early civilization used writing in more than one way at once. It used writing to count what needed management, and it used writing to protect what needed reverence. A ration entry and a royal beginning could both be pressed into clay, but they did not have to carry the same kind of truth. One belonged to the daily survival of the city. The other belonged to the long memory that helped the city understand why rule mattered. This brings us back to the human origin of the problem. Long before Sumer, human beings survived by carrying memory across fragile lives. A person could die, but a path could be remembered. A voice could vanish, but a warning could remain. A tool could break, but the skill to make it could pass to a child. Culture itself grew from this passing forward. Cities enlarged that ancient habit until memory had to become institutional. The past could no longer live only in elders, families, and repeated stories. It had to be stored in marks, names, lists, rituals, and public traditions. Once memory became stronger, it could also become stranger. It could preserve not only what had happened nearby, but what a community believed had to be true about its own beginning. The Sumerian King List may have kept enormous reigns because a short-lived society needed kingship to appear older than short life. It may have used number to create a depth that ordinary memory could not supply. It may have made the first rulers unreachable so that later rule could feel inherited from a time beyond challenge. But even these explanations must remain open. They are careful ways of reading, not final keys. The clay does not tell us exactly what every scribe understood when copying those figures. It does not reveal whether a number was heard as sacred magnitude, inherited convention, learned pattern, royal ideology, or several of these at once. What it does reveal is the quiet tension at the beginning of written history. Human beings had learned to make memory durable, but durability did not make memory simple. It allowed practical records and sacred distance to survive together. It allowed real cities to stand beside impossible time. It allowed the political world of mud, canals, grain, and kings to be joined to a beginning no fragile body could ever reach alone. That is why the list still unsettles us. It comes from a civilization that knew enough about order to record its world, yet chose to leave at the center of that order a number that order itself cannot explain. The 28,000-year reigns are not a solved fact waiting to be used as proof of wonder. They are a preserved question, pressed into clay, asking why human authority needed an origin so much larger than human life. By the time the Sumerian King List reaches us, it no longer feels like a simple ancient curiosity. It has become a path through mud, rivers, cities, temples, names, floods, numbers, and the human fear of forgetting. At the beginning of that path was clay, ordinary earth made wet enough to receive a sign, then firm enough to hold it after the hand was gone. Clay was humble, but it changed memory. It allowed grain to be counted, labor to be assigned, offerings to be recorded, and names to remain when voices faded. From that same material came a royal tradition that placed kingship inside a vast sequence of cities. Eridu, Kish, Uruk, Ur, and other remembered places were not merely dots on a map. They were centers of work and worship, places where water had to be guided, food had to be stored, and human cooperation had to survive beyond one season. The list joins these earthly places to a scale of time that the body cannot enter. Kings before the flood are given reigns so long that the ordinary rhythm of birth, aging, and death disappears. This is where the cold paradox remains. The text is real, the scribal tradition is real, the cities are rooted in Mesopotamian memory, yet the reigns stand beyond biological life. A responsible reading does not turn those reigns into proof of impossible bodies. It also does not throw them away as empty invention. Instead, it lets them reveal a deeper layer of early civilization, the need to give authority an origin older than ordinary memory. The flood then stands as the great break in that remembered order. Water, which fed the fields and made city life possible, also became the image of loss. Before the flood, time is vast and remote. After the flood, kingship returns, and the sequence moves gradually toward a world closer to human political memory. This movement matters because it reflects an old pattern in the human mind. From the earliest communities, people lived by carrying knowledge forward through fragile bodies. They remembered paths, dangers, ancestors, graves, tools, water, and the consequences of loss. When cities emerged, that burden grew heavier. A city needed memory that could outlast the bodies inside it. It needed records, but it also needed meaning. It needed to know not only how much barley entered a storehouse, but why power belonged somewhere, why order should be trusted, and why the present did not stand alone. The Sumerian King List brings all of this together. Its clay reminds us of practical administration. Its cities remind us of real landscapes. Its kings remind us of political authority. Its flood reminds us that order can break. Its immense numbers remind us that human beings often make origins larger when ordinary memory can no longer reach them. The list survives because early civilization did not separate these needs as cleanly as we might. Survival, belief, counting, legitimacy, and longing could all live on the same tablet. That is why the 28,000-year reigns still matter, even when they cannot be accepted as literal lifespans. They stand as signs of a culture trying to protect a beginning from the erosion of time. They show that written history did not begin as a perfectly clear mirror. It began as a human instrument, shaped by hands that counted real things and also preserved sacred distance. This is not only a Mesopotamian problem, it reaches back to the older condition of our species. Every human group has had to live between the shortness of a body and the length of what it hopes to carry forward. A parent teaches a child, a community buries its dead, a city repairs a wall built by people whose names are gone. The King List makes that tension visible on a royal scale. In the silence of those numbers, we hear not a solved answer, but the weight of a civilization trying to remember farther than any person could live. The value of the Sumerian King List is not that it gives us an easy answer. Its value is that it teaches a slower way of meeting the past. Many people come to ancient texts hoping that the distance will suddenly open, that one phrase, one number, word, one damaged tablet will explain everything that time has hidden. But the past rarely works like that. It gives traces. It gives names with missing edges. It gives cities partly buried, traditions copied long after their first telling, and numbers that do not fit the body. To listen honestly, we have to accept both the presence of evidence and the limits of evidence. That may be the most useful lesson carried by the 28,000-year reigns. They remind us that history is not only a collection of solved facts, it is also a discipline of restraint. It asks us to say what can be said, to leave unsaid what cannot be supported, and to resist the temptation to fill every silence with invention. This restraint does not make the story weaker, it makes it more human. Early Mesopotamians lived with uncertainty too. They lived in a landscape where water could support life and threaten it, where cities could rise and fall, where rulers could claim permanence while their bodies remained mortal. Their writing preserved both practical accounts and sacred memory because human life needed both order and meaning. We are not so different in that need. Modern people may have scientific dating, archives, museums, satellite maps, and careful methods, but we still ask why beginnings matter. We still want to know whether the world we inherit has a depth beneath it. We still feel the unease of standing inside a brief life while looking backward into a time too large for imagination. At the origin of our species, memory helped people survive by carrying knowledge forward. Which plants could be eaten, where danger appeared, how tools were made, how children learned, how the dead remained present in the minds of the living. Later, in the first cities, memory became heavier and more formal. It had to hold not only survival knowledge, but authority, obligation, identity, and law. The Sumerian King List belongs to that enlarged memory. It shows us a civilization trying to place rule inside a past so deep that no ruler could own it completely. The educational value is not to believe every ancient claim literally, and not to reject ancient minds as simple or foolish. The value is to learn how to hold a difficult source with care. A clay tablet can be real and still contain legend. A city can be archaeological and still carry sacred meaning. A number can be precise in shape and symbolic in function. A royal tradition can preserve memory and reshape memory at the same time. These distinctions matter because they train us to think more clearly, not only about Sumer, but about every story that claims to explain where we came from. When evidence is limited, honesty becomes a form of respect. It respects the ancient people by not turning them into props for modern fantasy. It respects the listener by not offering false certainty. It respects the past by allowing it to remain partly unknown. The King List, therefore, gives a quiet lesson in humility. Human beings have always tried to make time understandable, but time is larger than any list we create. We press signs into clay, write books, build archives, and record names. Yet some meanings still survive only as questions. Perhaps that is not a failure. Perhaps it is one reason history remains valuable for a tired mind at night. It teaches that not every mystery must be forced into an answer before it can give us wisdom. Sometimes the careful boundary around what we do not know is what keeps the truth alive. At the end of the Sumerian King List, what remains is not a solved mystery but a calmer kind of awareness. The clay does not ask us to believe that human bodies once ruled for 28,000 years. It asks us to notice that one of the earliest writing cultures placed power inside a time so deep that ordinary life could not contain it. A king was mortal, a city was vulnerable, a canal could fill with silt, a wall could crack, a temple could be rebuilt by hands that never knew the first builders. Yet the idea of kingship was made to travel through all of it, descending, moving, breaking, returning, and being remembered again. That is the quiet lesson. Human beings have always lived between short breath and long memory. We are born into worlds already named by others. We inherit languages, tools, fields, rules, fears, and hopes that began before our own first awareness. Then, for a little while, we add our own marks. Some are practical, like a measure of grain, a repair made to a wall, a lesson given to a child. Some are less visible, like patience, caution, and the willingness to tell the truth even when the truth is incomplete. The Sumerian scribes did not give us a modern answer to the long reigns. They gave us evidence of a human effort to keep origin, authority, loss, and renewal inside one remembered shape. That effort is still recognizable. Every civilization wants a beginning large enough to hold its present. Every person, in a quieter way, wants to feel that life is not only a brief moment between forgetting and being forgotten, but history teaches humility. It teaches that a real text can be mysterious without becoming proof of fantasy. It teaches that ancient people could think seriously, symbolically, politically, and spiritually at the same time. It teaches that numbers may count, but they may also magnify. It teaches that not every silence in the past should be filled with our own inventions. This restraint protects both the listener and the dead, because it lets evidence speak without forcing it to become more certain than it is. If there is value in listening to the King List at night, it may be this. The past does not need to flatter us, shock us, or obey us in order to matter. It can remain partly unknown and still guide the mind toward care. The long reigns before the flood may never become ordinary chronology. They may remain at the edge where memory becomes sacred distance. But even there, they speak of something deeply human, the wish to continue beyond the body, beyond the generation, beyond the city that will one day fall silent. That wish began long before Sumer, when our ancestors carried knowledge in voices and gestures under open skies. It entered clay when cities needed memory stronger than speech. It reaches us now because one fragile species kept trying to make time hold meaning. The Sumerian King List records kings who ruled for 28,000 years, and we cannot explain it cleanly. But perhaps its final gift is not an explanation. Perhaps it is a discipline of careful wonder, a way of standing before ancient evidence without turning away from the limits of what can be known. The list leaves us with clay, water, cities, vanished hands, and numbers too large for the human body. It leaves us with the knowledge that people were already asking how order begins, how memory survives, and how a short-lived creature can belong to a time it will never see entirely. And as the mind grows very quiet, with patience, humility, and care, the question remains open. Were those impossible reigns a failed record of years, or a sign that humanity has always needed its beginnings to be older, deeper, and more mysterious than life itself could ever prove?